"Sir, step away from the driveway right now." The officer's voice cut through the quiet suburban street like a siren that hadn't even started yet, and just like that the calm Saturday morning on Maplewood Drive froze in place as David Coleman slowly turned his head, sunlight catching the edge of his glasses while his 8-year-old daughter sat quietly in the back seat of the black SUV parked halfway up the driveway of the house he had lived in for nearly 5 years, the garage door halfway open, the scent of fresh-cut grass still hanging in the air from the lawn service that had left just 10 minutes earlier. And yet somehow none of that seemed to matter to Officer Ryan Mitchell, who stood near the curb with one hand resting on his belt and the other gesturing firmly toward the street as if he were directing traffic instead of speaking to a father standing in front of his own home. David didn't move right away. Not because he was defiant but because he'd seen this before, the quiet suspicion, the careful tone that wasn't loud but carried an unmistakable edge, the kind that suggested he was already being measured against something he hadn't even done. Across the street a white woman in a light blue cardigan stood on her porch holding her phone at chest height pretending not to record while clearly watching every movement, her golden retriever sitting beside her as if this were just another neighborhood event unfolding on a peaceful morning. David glanced briefly toward his daughter in the back seat, her small sneakers dangling above the floor mat, her eyes wide with the quiet confusion children carry when adults suddenly change the tone of the world around them. "I live here," David said calmly, his voice steady and even, but Officer Mitchell shook his head slightly, as though the statement itself were part of the problem. "We received a call about a suspicious individual," the officer replied, taking one step forward, gravel crunching under his boot, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the still air. Another patrol car rolled slowly down the street and stopped behind the first, its engine humming low, not flashing lights, not raised voices, just the quiet weight of authority settling onto a driveway that still held last night's chalk drawings from neighborhood kids. David folded his arms loosely, not defensive, just composed, his posture relaxed in a way that made the moment feel even more tense, because he wasn't reacting the way situations like this usually unfolded. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't arguing, he was simply standing there, calm and grounded, as if he understood something no one else on the street did. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle and move toward the sidewalk," Officer Mitchell continued, glancing briefly at the house behind David, a 2-story brick home with white shutters and a small American flag hanging near the front porch, the kind of house that symbolized stability, success, and years of hard work, yet somehow still not enough to stop suspicion from settling in. David exhaled slowly, the morning sun warming the concrete beneath his shoes, his phone resting quietly in his hand, and for a brief second, the entire street seemed to hold its breath as he looked from the officer to his daughter and then back again, the calm in his expression never breaking, because this wasn't the first time he had been asked to prove he belonged somewhere he had already earned, and deep down, he knew something the officers didn't yet understand, something that would change the tone of Maplewood Drive in just a few minutes. Something that would turn this quiet driveway into a moment no one watching would forget. David Coleman did not move from the driveway, and that stillness unsettled the moment more than any raised voice could have, because Officer Ryan Mitchell expected hesitation or irritation or at least a defensive explanation, but instead David simply stood there with calm shoulders and steady eyes while the second patrol car idled behind the first, its engine humming softly as another officer stepped out and adjusted his radio. The quiet suburban street now carrying a tension that felt heavier than the warm morning air. Across the street Karen Whitmore lowered her phone slightly but did not stop recording, her expression fixed in the kind of cautious curiosity that often appeared when something unusual happened in a neighborhood that prided itself on predictability. David glanced toward his daughter again and gave her a small reassuring smile, the kind parents use when they want children to believe everything is under control even when the situation clearly is not. "Daddy, are we going somewhere?" she asked softly through the slightly open window, her voice barely audible yet somehow cutting through the tension. "Not yet, sweetheart," David replied gently, his tone calm and warm, and that simple exchange seemed to slow time even further, because it reminded everyone watching that this was not a confrontation between strangers but a father standing beside his child in front of his own home. Officer Mitchell cleared his throat and shifted his stance. "Sir, I need you to comply and step toward the sidewalk," he repeated, his voice firmer now, but still controlled. David tilted his head slightly, as if considering the request, then spoke with quiet clarity. "Officer, I am standing on my property," he said, not challenging, not confrontational, just stating a fact that seemed to make the air feel even tighter. The second officer glanced briefly at the house behind David, taking in the neatly trimmed hedges, the bicycle resting near the garage, and the small basketball hoop mounted above the driveway. All signs of a lived-in home that did not match the narrative of suspicion that had arrived with the patrol cars. Another neighbor stepped outside 2 houses down, pretending to check the mail while clearly watching, and within seconds more curtains shifted and doors opened, the street slowly transforming into an audience drawn by quiet tension rather than noise. "We received a report that you were attempting to access this vehicle without permission," Officer Mitchell continued, gesturing toward the black SUV. David looked at the vehicle and then back at the officer, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly in a calm, almost thoughtful expression. "That is my vehicle," he replied, his voice steady, and yet the officer did not relax. Instead he glanced toward Karen across the street, who nodded slightly as if confirming something. The subtle exchange did not go unnoticed by the growing number of observers. David slipped his phone from his pocket and held it loosely at his side, not raising it, not dialing yet, just holding it as if time itself were part of his strategy. The sunlight reflected softly off the windshield, the neighborhood quiet except for distant lawn equipment and the low hum of idling engines, and despite the tension, David remained composed, grounded in place like someone who understood that sometimes silence carried more weight than argument, and as the seconds stretched longer, the officers seemed increasingly unsure of how to move forward, because the man they expected to react emotionally simply stood there calmly, a father on his driveway, waiting patiently for the moment when the truth would arrive. Officer Ryan Mitchell shifted his weight and glanced toward his partner as the quiet tension stretched across the driveway, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel louder, the distant hum of a lawn mower, the soft chirp of birds, and the faint click of Karen Whitmore adjusting her phone across the street. David Coleman remained still, his posture relaxed but grounded, as though he had anchored himself to the concrete beneath his feet. The second officer stepped closer now, his expression cautious yet firm. "Sir, we are asking you again to step away from the vehicle while we verify the situation," he said, and David nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without agreeing to the request. "I understand what you are asking," David replied calmly, "but I am not interfering with anything. I am standing in my driveway," his tone never rising, never defensive, just measured. The officers exchanged another glance, subtle but telling, because the situation was not unfolding the way they expected. Across the street Karen lowered her phone for a moment and called out, her voice careful but loud enough to carry, "That is him, he has been sitting there for a while." The statement hung in the air, vague yet loaded, and several neighbors shifted their attention toward her. One man near the mailbox frowned slightly, as if unsure what exactly she meant. David turned his head slowly toward Karen, his expression calm, not confrontational, just acknowledging her presence. Then he looked back at the officers. "I pulled into my driveway about 5 minutes ago," David explained. "I was about to take my daughter inside." His daughter leaned forward slightly from the back seat, her small voice drifting out again. "Daddy, are we late?" she asked, and David smiled gently. "No, sweetheart, we are okay." The moment softened the air briefly, but Officer Mitchell maintained his professional tone. "Sir, do you have identification with you?" he asked, and David nodded. "Yes, I do," he said, but he did not immediately reach for it. Instead he paused, as if weighing the moment carefully. The second officer glanced toward the house again, noticing the small garden near the walkway, the porch light still on from earlier that morning, and the pair of shoes resting neatly beside the front door. Signs that quietly contradicted the suspicion still lingering in the air. Another neighbor stepped closer along the sidewalk, holding a coffee mug, watching quietly. More phones appeared now, subtle but unmistakable, the street no longer just a quiet residential block but a gathering of witnesses drawn by the stillness of the moment. David finally shifted his phone slightly in his hand, the movement small yet deliberate. "Officer," he said calmly, "before we continue, I just want to make sure we are all clear," his voice steady and respectful. "I am not refusing to cooperate, I am simply standing at my home." The words settled into the space between them, and for a brief second the officers seemed unsure how to proceed, because nothing about David's demeanor suggested threat or resistance, only patience, only quiet confidence. And as the seconds passed, the growing audience sensed something changing, not loud, not dramatic, but subtle, like the first shift of wind before a storm. And David remained still, composed, waiting, as if he knew that what came next would not require him to raise his voice at all. The quiet street no longer felt quiet as more doors opened and more neighbors stepped onto their porches, drawn by the stillness and the presence of two patrol cars parked along Maplewood Drive, the morning sun reflecting off windshields while a man in a gray sweatshirt walked slowly down the sidewalk pretending to check his mailbox even though everyone knew he was watching the unfolding moment. David Coleman remained beside his SUV, calm and steady, while his daughter shifted slightly in the back seat, her small hands resting on her backpack as she watched the adults outside with growing curiosity. Officer Ryan Mitchell glanced around briefly, noticing the growing number of onlookers, and the shift in atmosphere made his posture tighten just slightly, because the moment was no longer private, it was becoming public, and that changed everything. Karen Whitmore lowered her phone for a second then raised it again, adjusting her position as if searching for a better angle, her expression cautious yet firm, and another neighbor, an older man with a baseball cap, stepped closer along the sidewalk. "Is everything all right here?" he asked. Quietly, his voice careful, not confrontational. Officer Mitchell nodded briefly without looking away from David. "We are handling a call," he replied, and the man nodded but did not step back. Instead he stayed near the curb, watching. Another woman across the street folded her arms, her eyes moving between David and the officers, the tension building not from noise but from observation, the quiet weight of witnesses gathering. David shifted his stance slightly, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he spoke calmly. "Officer, my identification is inside the house," he explained, gesturing toward the front door just 15 feet away, the short concrete path leading from the driveway to the porch. Officer Mitchell followed his gesture with his eyes, then looked back at David. "We would prefer you remain where you are," he replied, and the words hung in the air, subtle yet heavy. David nodded once, acknowledging the request, and the stillness returned, a stillness that seemed to stretch longer with every second. The second officer glanced again at the house, then at the driveway, then at David, uncertainty flickering briefly across his expression. Across the street Karen spoke again, her voice cautious but audible. "I did not recognize him," she said, and the statement drifted across the street, vague yet impactful. David turned slightly toward her, not with frustration but with a calm recognition, then looked back at the officers. "I moved here last year," he said quietly, his tone measured, and that simple sentence seemed to shift the moment again, because it explained everything and nothing at the same time. More neighbors now stood quietly, phones held low, capturing the scene without speaking, and the quiet suburban street that normally held the sounds of weekend routines now carried only the low hum of engines and the weight of expectation. David slipped his phone gently into his palm, his expression unchanged, and as the seconds passed, the gathering crowd sensed that the moment was building towards something, not loud, not sudden, but inevitable, like the calm before a shift that no one yet fully understood. The tension thickened as Officer Ryan Mitchell took a slow step closer to David Coleman, the gravel beneath his boots crunching softly while the growing crowd of neighbors shifted subtly along the sidewalks and porches, the quiet suburban street now holding more eyes than anyone expected just minutes earlier. David remained calm beside his SUV, the sunlight reflecting across the windshield while his daughter leaned forward slightly from the back seat, her voice soft but uncertain. "Daddy, why are they still here?" she asked, and David turned just enough to offer a reassuring smile. "Everything is all right, sweetheart, just give me a minute," he said gently, but the moment had already crossed into something heavier. Officer Mitchell lifted his radio briefly and spoke in a low voice that still carried across the quiet air, requesting additional verification, his tone professional yet firm. The second officer shifted position near the front of the patrol car, watching David closely while also scanning the growing crowd. Karen Whitmore adjusted her phone again, her expression tightening slightly as more neighbors gathered. A man in a navy jacket stepped closer near the curb and quietly asked another neighbor what was happening. Whispers began to circulate, subtle but present. David exhaled slowly and glanced toward the house once more, the front porch still bathed in sunlight, the American flag near the railing barely moving in the still air. Then Officer Mitchell spoke again. "Sir, for now I am going to ask you to remain exactly where you are until we confirm your identity." The request sounded calm but carried a weight that made several neighbors exchange glances. David nodded once, acknowledging the words without argument, his calm demeanor only adding to the tension. because he did not appear confused or frustrated, only patient. The second officer glanced at David's daughter in the back seat and then back at David, the quiet humanity of the moment settling in as the child watched everything unfold. David shifted his phone in his hand, his movements slow and deliberate, then he looked at Officer Mitchell with steady eyes. "Officer, I understand you are doing your job," he said calmly, "but I would like to call someone to clarify this." The officers exchanged another glance, the request reasonable yet signaling a shift. "You can make a call," Officer Mitchell replied cautiously. David nodded slightly and raised his phone, dialing with unhurried precision, the quiet beeping of the call barely audible yet somehow drawing every eye toward him. Neighbors leaned slightly forward, phones still recording. The second stretched as the call connected. David lifted the phone to his ear, his posture unchanged, and spoke calmly. "Yes, it is me," he said, his voice steady. "They are here again." The simple sentence seemed to ripple through the moment, the officers watching closely, unsure of who he had called, the crowd growing quieter, the air heavier, and David listened for a brief moment before nodding once. "I understand," he said softly, then lowered the phone, slipping it back into his hand with the same calm confidence he had carried from the start, and as the silence returned, even the officers seemed to sense that something had shifted, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like a quiet signal sent into motion that would soon arrive on Maplewood Drive. The silence after David Coleman ended. The call felt heavier than anything that had come before, the quiet suburban street holding its breath as Officer Ryan Mitchell watched him closely, trying to read the calm expression that had not changed since the first request to step away from the driveway. The second officer shifted slightly near the patrol car, glancing down the street as if expecting something yet unsure what that something might be. Neighbors continued to gather quietly, a woman in a white sweater stepping onto her porch, while a teenager paused halfway down the sidewalk with earbuds hanging loosely around his neck. Karen Whitmore lowered her phone briefly and then raised it again, her posture stiff as she sensed the shift in the moment. David remained beside the SUV, his daughter watching from the back seat, her small face pressed slightly toward the window. "Daddy, can we go inside now?" she asked softly, and David turned toward her with the same calm reassurance. "Soon, sweetheart, just a little longer," he replied gently. Officer Mitchell cleared his throat and adjusted his stance. "Who did you call, sir?" he asked, his tone still professional but edged with curiosity. David looked at him calmly. "Someone who can help clarify this situation," he answered simply, not defensive, not revealing, just matter of fact. The officers exchanged another glance, the subtle uncertainty now more visible as the second stretched. A light breeze moved through the street, rustling the leaves of a small maple tree. Near the curb, the distant sound of a delivery truck echoed from another block, and yet all attention remained fixed on the quiet driveway where David stood. The second officer spoke quietly into his radio again, his voice low but measured, while Officer Mitchell scanned the growing crowd, noticing more phones raised discreetly, more neighbors stepping closer, the moment no longer just a routine call but something being watched, documented, remembered. David shifted his weight slightly, still relaxed, still composed, his phone resting loosely in his hand, as if he knew time itself was working in his favor. Across the street Karen glanced down the road, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she too sensed something approaching. A faint sound in the distance began to grow, not loud, not dramatic, just the low hum of approaching engines, subtle at first but enough to draw attention. The second officer turned his head slightly, listening, while Officer Mitchell followed the sound, the crowd quieting further as the noise grew closer. David did not move, his calm demeanor unchanged, his posture steady, as if he had expected this moment all along, and within seconds the faint hum became more distinct, vehicles turning onto Maplewood Drive, the sunlight reflecting off dark windshields as they approached slowly, the quiet suburban street shifting again, the air tightening with anticipation, and David remained still beside his driveway, calm and composed, while the officers and neighbors watched the approaching vehicles that were about to change everything. The dark vehicles rolled slowly onto Maplewood Drive, their engines low and controlled, not flashing lights, not sirens, just a quiet authority that immediately shifted the atmosphere. Neighbors leaned forward slightly, phones raised a little higher, while Officer Ryan Mitchell narrowed his eyes, trying to understand why three black SUVs were turning into a quiet residential street on a calm Saturday morning. The vehicles stopped one after another along the curb, their doors opening almost in unison, and several individuals stepped out wearing dark suits and calm expressions, their presence measured and professional, the kind of presence that did not need volume to command attention. David Coleman remained still beside his driveway, his posture relaxed, his daughter watching from the back seat with wide curious eyes. The suited individuals walked toward the driveway with steady steps. One woman at the front holding a small leather folder, her gaze focused and composed. "Officer." Mitchell glanced briefly at his partner, the uncertainty now visible, as the woman approached and spoke calmly. "Good morning, officers," her tone respectful but firm. She glanced toward David briefly, then back to the officers. "We received a call regarding this situation," she continued. The second officer shifted slightly. "And you are?" he asked cautiously. The woman opened the leather folder and displayed identification in a smooth motion. "Special Agent Laura Bennett," she said calmly, the words settling heavily in the quiet street. Neighbors exchanged glances, whispers beginning to ripple softly through the crowd. Officer Mitchell straightened slightly, his posture adjusting as he examined the identification, then looked toward the other suited individuals who had now positioned themselves quietly behind her, their calm demeanor reinforcing the shift in authority. David remained silent, his expression unchanged, while his daughter leaned forward again, sensing something different in the air. Karen Whitmore lowered her phone slightly, her expression shifting from certainty to confusion as the situation unfolded in a direction she had not expected. Agent Bennett turned slightly toward David, her tone respectful. "Mr. Coleman," she said. And David nodded once, calm and composed, the acknowledgement brief but meaningful. The officers exchanged another glance, the quiet suburban street now holding a different kind of tension, one that no longer centered on suspicion but on realization. The sunlight reflected off the black SUVs while neighbors stood quietly, absorbing the moment. Agent Bennett turned back to Officer Mitchell. "We would like to clarify the nature of this call," she said calmly, her voice steady, and the officers, who had arrived expecting a routine verification, now found themselves standing in a moment that had shifted entirely, the crowd silent, the street still, and David Coleman remained beside his driveway, calm and patient, as the balance of authority quietly moved in his favor. Officer Ryan Mitchell straightened slightly as Special Agent Laura Bennett closed her identification and stepped forward with calm authority. The quiet street now filled with a different kind of tension, not suspicion but realization. The second officer shifted beside the patrol car, his earlier confidence fading as he glanced toward the black SUVs and the suited individual standing quietly behind Agent Bennett. David Coleman remained still beside his driveway, his posture relaxed, his daughter watching carefully from the back seat, sensing the change even without understanding it. Agent Bennett spoke calmly. "We were informed there was a concern regarding Mr. Coleman," she said, her tone professional and steady. Officer Mitchell cleared his throat. "We received a call about a suspicious individual attempting to access a vehicle," he replied, his voice measured, but now noticeably more cautious. Agent Bennett nodded once, then glanced toward David. "Mr. Coleman lives here," she said calmly, the simple statement settling over the street like a quiet correction. Several neighbors exchanged glances, and Karen Whitmore lowered her phone slightly, her expression tightening as the moment shifted further. The second officer looked toward the house again, the porch, the driveway, the small details that now seemed obvious. Agent Bennett continued, "We also received confirmation prior to arriving," she added, her tone still composed. The officers listened quietly, the calm authority in her voice leaving little room for doubt. David shifted slightly and looked toward his daughter again, offering another reassuring smile, while the crowd remained silent, absorbing the unfolding moment. The sunlight reflected across the black SUVs, the quiet suburban street now transformed into a place of quiet accountability. Officer Mitchell nodded slowly. "Understood," he replied, the firmness in his voice softened by the realization settling in. Agent Bennett turned slightly toward David. "Mr. Coleman, thank you for your patience," she said respectfully, and David nodded once, calm as ever, the acknowledgement brief yet meaningful. Across the street Karen Whitmore lowered her phone further, her posture less certain now, while the older man near the curb folded his arms thoughtfully, the subtle shift in the crowd visible, the tension that had once focused on David now moving quietly toward reflection. Agent Bennett turned back toward the officers. "We appreciate your cooperation," she said calmly, and the officers nodded, their posture adjusting as the moment resolved. David remained beside his driveway, calm and composed, the balance of authority now fully shifted, the quiet street returning slowly to normal, but the impact of the moment lingering in the air as neighbors watched the scene settle, understanding that something important had just unfolded in front of them. The tension that had filled Maplewood Drive slowly began to ease as Special Agent Laura Bennett stepped back and the suited individuals behind her remained calm and composed, their presence quiet but unmistakable. Officer Ryan Mitchell nodded once more and adjusted his stance, the authority that had once guided the moment now replaced with a careful professionalism. "Thank you for your patience, sir," he said to David Coleman. His voice measured and respectful. David nodded calmly, his expression unchanged, the quiet confidence still resting in his posture as if the entire situation had unfolded exactly as he expected. Across the street Karen Whitmore lowered her phone completely now, her shoulders slightly tense as she watched the scene settle. Neighbors began to shift slowly, some stepping back toward their homes, others exchanging quiet glances that carried unspoken reflections. David turned toward the SUV and opened the rear door. His daughter looked up at him with curious eyes. "Are we okay now?" she asked softly, and David smiled warmly. "Yes, sweetheart, we are okay," he replied gently. She stepped out carefully, holding her backpack, and David closed the door quietly, the simple movement grounding the moment back into something human and ordinary. Agent Bennett offered a small nod to David before turning back toward the black SUVs, her team moving with quiet efficiency as they prepared to leave. The engine started softly, the vehicles pulling away one by one, the low hum fading as they exited the street. The patrol cars remained for a moment longer. Officer Mitchell glanced toward David once more. "Have a good day, sir," he said, and David nodded. "You as well," he replied calmly. The exchange brief but meaningful. The officers returned to their vehicles, the engine starting, and within seconds they too began to pull away. The quiet suburban street gradually returning to its usual rhythm. Neighbors stepped back onto their porches, phones lowered, conversations beginning in hushed tones. Karen Whitmore stood still for a moment longer before turning slowly toward her front door. David watched the street settle, then looked toward his daughter again, taking her hand gently as they walked toward the front door, the sunlight warming the porch steps beneath their feet, the American flag fluttering softly in the breeze. And just before stepping inside, David paused briefly, glancing back at the quiet street, his voice calm and steady as he spoke softly to his daughter. "Sometimes people do not know who you are," he said gently, "but you do not have to raise your voice to be heard." She looked up at him thoughtfully, and together they stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind them. Maplewood Drive returning to calm, but the lesson of the morning lingering in the air, a reminder that dignity did not require noise, and that real authority often arrived quietly, changing everything without a single shout.